everybody, Alex Newman here with Conversations That Matter for the New American Magazine. Thank you for joining us. We have a very special guest today. Her name is Rasna Warah. She's a former official with UN Habitat. This is a UN agency that deals with human settlements and housing and things like this, urban development. She saw unbelievable amounts of corruption and lawlessness there. She ended up leaving, and she's now a consultant and a writer. She's written a couple of books. We've talked to her before about her previous book called Unsilenced. Very, very interesting book. A lot of details about some of the corruption that is just absolutely pervasive in the United Nations. And she's got a new book now. That's why we invited her on again. The new book is called Lords of Impunity: How the United Nations Failed the World and What Can Be Done to Transform It. Rasna, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into the book, just tell us a little bit about your experience working for the United Nations. What did you see while you were there? What troubled you so much that you had to speak out? What was your experience?
Thanks, Alex, for having me on your show. Well, I worked for the UN Habitat for about 10 years. Most of those years were very happy years. I really enjoyed my work. I was working with a great team of people, data analysts, etc., looking at urban trends. But towards the end of my career at the UN, I stumbled across some missing donor funds. And when I tried to investigate where the money had gone, whether it had just been either misappropriated or had been used on a project that had not been recorded, a ton of bricks fell on my head, and suddenly all my supervisors were practically in my office saying that I should never ask where this money went. I can't tell you where the money came from, but it was a donor, an Arab country's money. And that's when I started realizing that actually there was something that was being hidden from not just me, but from the organization, and that perhaps the money had been diverted to some unapproved projects. And barely had I begun to, come around that, I also was at that time editing the State of the World Cities report, and I had pointed out to my boss that some of the data he was using was, had been derived at unscientifically, and that I could not publish that data. And so there were, daggers drawn on all sides, and before I knew it, I was being victimized, being called a liar in meetings. My contract renewal was always, there was a question mark whether they'd renew my contract. There was a lot of psychological torture. My boss basically stopped talking to me. And it was at this time that I realized that I had become a whistleblower. Inadvertently, I didn't even think I was a whistleblower. I just thought I was doing my job. And as a result of that, I was sort of psychologically, I would say, tortured to the point where I left the organization. And then as subsequently, I got in touch with the Government Accountability Project, which is based in Washington, which protects whistleblowers, and realized that actually it wasn't just me, but there were dozens and dozens of UN whistleblowers who had suffered retaliation as a result of their exposures. And I realized this was a trend, and that's what led to my first book, Unsilenced, which is really the story of some of the whistleblowers who I joined forces with to challenge the UN, and even wrote to the UN Secretary General to look into our cases and to protect whistleblowers, which it doesn't do despite the fact that the UN has a whistleblower protection policy. After that, I realized that actually it wasn't just the whistleblowers who were suffering, but that the beneficiaries of UN projects were also suffering because a lot of the aid that was given to them either was stolen or diverted. A lot of the UN employees, including peacekeepers, were sexually exploiting people who were most dependent on them for protection, such as internally displaced people and refugees. And none of these people who had been accused of theft, including a senior UN official during the Oil for Food program in Iraq, which was one of the biggest scandals the UN has had to date, where basically Saddam Hussein was diverting oil meant for the program into his personal coffers. And some UN employees had also benefited from this corruption, but none of them were prosecuted, none of them were brought to court, so that's an example of how when the UN allows wrongdoing to continue, beneficiaries of the projects also suffer. So that's why I felt that actually I should do a book that actually looks at the bigger picture of whether the UN is really helping the world, or whether it's living up to its mandate, which is to prevent wars and to protect the human rights of all people. As you can see what's happening in Ukraine, the UN has just remained a passive bystander as the war rages on and as millions of people become refugees. So this is a constant trend. So I try to explain in the book, my new book, why this is so, why the UN is so ineffectual, and why it gets away with all kinds of crimes.
Excellent. Yeah, and when we get to the other side of the break, I want to talk specifics about how this situation has developed over the years. But before we do that, it's just critical that people understand that you are not the only one alleging these things. In fact, I myself have spoken to many whistleblowers from within the UN, including, I've spoken to people all the way up to Undersecretary General of the UN who have been absolutely appalled with the corruption, with the rape of children by UN peacekeepers and UN supposed aid workers and the Central African Republic. And then they go after the whistleblowers instead of the people raping the children. It's mind-blowing stuff. And you almost have to kind of see this to believe that something so horrific could take place. Rasna, before we go to break, we're going to go to break in just a couple of minutes, but give us some insight into some of the different types of crimes that you have seen, that you write about in this book, some of the crimes that are taking place within the UN organization right now, hiding behind diplomatic immunity and impunity.
Well, in recent years, thanks to the Me Too movement and also the Black Lives Matter movement, we've also realized that actually the UN can be as racist and sexist as anybody else. So they've been, it's just a reflection of the wider society. The UN is not a sacred cow. The people who work there are not more noble than others or more ethical. And we've seen in recent months, especially in the last couple of years as well, how women who report sexual harassment have been fired. There's been a survey that shows that slightly more than half of UN employees who describe themselves as Africans or African descendants have experienced racism. We've seen how, despite sort of 20 years of intervention in countries like Afghanistan has now basically reverted back to the Taliban and remains one of the poorest countries on earth. We have seen how when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, allegedly by the Saudi prince Salman, the UN did not raise a voice in defense of press freedom or even insisting that his murderers be brought to justice. These are just some of the recent cases which show that actually quite often it is the most powerful and influential member states of the UN.
Rasna, we're going to have to go to break right now, but we'll be right back after this break and we'll continue this discussion. Before the break, Rasna, you were talking about how powerful countries within the UN system really have the ability to quash important investigations, and you were talking about the case of the journalist who was murdered, I think in an embassy, if I'm not mistaken, in Turkey.
Yes, in Istanbul.
Please continue. Yep, please go ahead.
Jamal, yeah. So, for example, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in an embassy in Istanbul. I think it was 2019 or 2018. And all fingers, including a UN rapporteur's report, pointed at the Saudi Prince Salman, who probably ordered the execution of the journalist. There was a 100-page report written by the UN rapporteur, and just remember, UN rapporteurs are independent of the UN, so they can criticize the UN, where Agnes Kalama, who, reprimanded the UN for not taking a stand in defense of the journalist. And these are the kinds of things that happen because Saudi Arabia is a very big donor to the UN. 6 months before Jamal Khashoggi's murder, had given $1 billion to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to support humanitarian relief efforts in Yemen, even though Saudi Arabia is one of the countries that are responsible for the humanitarian crisis because it has been bombing Yemen for the last few years without suffering any sort of sanctions. So whereas now, so quite often it's the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which are the US, the Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China, call the shots in the UN. So it's not a club of equals. And therefore, the majority of the world's people and governments have very little power or influence to impact how the UN functions, which countries are sanctioned, so basically it's not a club of equals. So we're just pretending it's a club of equals when it's not.
Rasna, I want to ask you about the impunity for criminals, and we can get back to kind of possible reforms for the UN. I think it's a strange idea, even that, but the whole idea of a club of equals. Should the dictator of North Korea have equal representation to all the people of Kenya through their democratic government? And I don't know. That's a fair question, I think. But I want to ask you about these crimes that are taking place, because these things that we're talking about, these are not just differences of opinion. I mean, we're talking about criminal activity. We're talking about sexual harassment. We're talking about the rape of children. We're talking about the theft of money. And these things are not punished, as you point out. There's just this culture of impunity where more often than not, the whistleblowers and the people trying to stop it are the ones who are punished. Why is it that it's so difficult to get accountability for people who are doing these just horrific things?
Well, one of the things that kicks in when a whistleblower reports misconduct is that the UN now begins to protect its reputation. So there's a whole army of people who then begin the spin doctoring to protect the UN's reputation. In the case, for example, of the children in the Central African Republic who were sexually abused by peacekeepers, the UN's first instinct was to reprimand the whistleblower who told the French government about the abuse because these were French peacekeepers, and actually basically suspended him rather than investigating further the accusations. So it's very much, it's sort of like the Catholic Church, with protecting priests who sexually molest boys and girls in the church. It's the first instinct is protect the reputation of the institution. Secondly, and most importantly, the reason why you cannot take a UN employee to court and cannot press charges is because all international UN employees enjoy immunity from prosecution, which is bestowed on them by the UN Charter. Now, unless you change the UN Charter, UN employees can get away with any kind of crime, including murder, rape, theft, you name it. they cannot be tried in any national court. They enjoy immunity from prosecution. Now, the rationale for that was because UN people work in dangerous countries where there's no rule of law. You cannot trust a UN employee to carry out his or her duties, if there's a dictator who's just going to haul him into jail on trumped up charges. But I think we really have to rethink this immunity clause, because it's allowed thousands and thousands of UN employees to commit crimes, which in any country would be prosecuted.
Yeah.
So
it's true. It's and there's so much that it's happened in Haiti. It's and I keep coming across it, Rasna, and it seems like nothing changes. I want to ask you. We've only got about 3.5 minutes left before the end of the broadcast, but I want to ask you for your ideas on how to reform this. I know, my personal opinion is that the UN is just so corrupt, it's so dangerous, it ought to be dismantled. I know you don't share that view. So I'm curious, you were on the inside. I've never been on the inside. What do you think should be done to fix it? I mean, assuming somebody believes in these lofty ideals of having a global organization that's going to implement peace and things, how can it be changed so that we don't have all this crime running wild?
Yeah. Well, in my book, I've given like 5 recommendations, and I'll just go over it very quickly. One is what I just talked about, is to remove the immunity from prosecution clause from the UN Charter. Mm-hmm. That will require a lot of lobbying by governments, but I believe it should be done in the interest of humanity. And then I think that secondly, they should replace the UN Ethics Office, which is supposed to protect UN whistleblowers, with an independent external body that arbitrates on whistleblower cases, so that the people sitting on that, in this, whatever you want to call it, tribunal, are not UN employees beholden to the UN Secretary General or to their bosses or to any individual government. It should be completely independent and external to the UN. The other thing I've recommended is that the European Commission should change its laws so that it can audit UN programs to see where their funding is going. Currently, the EU does not audit UN projects because it allows the UN to do it, which is really allowing the fox to guard the chicken coop. And then also, which the US government did not very successfully, but under Obama administration, withdraw funding from any UN organization that has been shown to not protect whistleblowers. Currently, the US government has a law that says 15% of US funding should be withdrawn. But quite often, it's hard to prove that if a whistleblower was retaliated against, because the UN ethics always sides with the perpetrator. So almost always. So it's difficult even to implement this US law. I think every rich country that gives money to the UN should have such a law. And also, like I said earlier, I know you said North Korea would not be a very good member of the, but let's look at size. The majority of the population lives in Asia and Africa. Some of these countries like India, Brazil, Latin America, have huge populations. They represent, almost 2/3 of the world's population. Why do we not have such countries on the UN Security Council? If you just look demographically, economically, countries like South Africa, new emerging economies like India, why are they not in the UN Security Council?
That's a fair question. Rasna, we are just about out of time, but before we let you go, I want to make sure that people have an opportunity to find out where to get your book. What's the best place to get your book, Lords of Impunity, How the United Nations Failed the World and What Can Be Done to Transform It?
Well, it's currently on Amazon and it'll be on Kindle very soon.
Well, Rasna, we really appreciate you joining us all the way from Kenya to talk about these important matters. Please keep us updated on your work. We appreciate you having the courage to speak out on these things. Thank you again for joining us. Folks, that was Rasna Warah.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Folks, that was Rasna Warah, author of Lords of Impunity, How the United Nations Failed the World and What Can Be Done to Transform It. I'm Alex Newman. This is Conversations That Matter. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, God bless you all.